Okay. I don't hear the mic. Do you hear the mic? All right. My time begins in 3, 2, 1. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Side government's world is a world in which the inhabitants of Earth look on while others suffer. Now, most of us would intuitively say that this is being a bystander at its very best and being cruel at its very worst. Yet side government hides this evil stance behind a grandstanding rhetoric, and instead, side opposition urges the inhabitants of Earth to do the right thing. So proud to oppose. In this speech, I will begin with some rebuttal before moving on to our constructive case. First, on their point about a moral duty to ourselves. As my partner pointed out in her POI, the cost to the inhabitants of Earth would be pretty much trivial, so we can disregard their points about resources and the chance of it spreading to us, since we have the cure. As to their point about the principle of non-interference, we believe that presumably this is not the only moral value that we on Earth have, and it's much more important to protect life and to help others, and that this principle should be one that trumps non-interference. Moreover, they brought up the analogy of COVID-19 and how developed nations refuse to offer supplies to developing nations because they prioritize their own citizens. Applying our principle, we say that this was immoral and that developed countries, like the inhabitants of Earth in this case, have a duty to look out for others given that they have the resources. Second, on their point about how this interaction will be bad. First, they say that humans are greedy and that we will go out and seek to exploit these alien creatures. However, on the info slide, it clearly states that this is a benevolent advanced species. We can assume that we are going to try to do our best to do the right thing. Therefore, side government has a burden of proof to show that there will be unanticipated negative harms, not necessarily consequences that result from evil intent. In addition, with respect to their point about psychological impact, we believe that this is outweighed by the literal biological harm of the Black Plague, massive amounts of alien creatures dying. And finally, as to their point about dependency, we believe that this can be sufficiently avoided with wise policy planning, such as saying every time you receive help, you have to pay a small tax. This is a small mechanistic fix, but we believe that the moral imperative to help other species outweighs all of this. Now, to move on to my constructive case, side opposition brings this case to you under the overarching value of responsibility. As a wise Spider-Man once said, with great power comes great responsibility. And it's this very simple principle that we apply in this debate. And under this, we have three contentions. First, complicity. Second, the inherent value of life. And third, the search for truth. Now, to elaborate on my first contention of complicity, if we, as people on Earth, have both the ability to help and the knowledge that we must help this other planet, and we choose not to do so, we are essentially tolerating mass death. We become complicit in an alien genocide because we could have saved them and chose not to. This is a very simple analogy I can draw to the concept of gross negligence in law, where you should be held accountable if you had a reasonable responsibility to help them and you didn't. We believe that given the great disparity in power and technology between these two planets, those in the advanced society essentially have a caretaker status, and they must act on that. There's a reason that, for instance, if you're a doctor and you refuse to treat a patient, you can be held liable. And while side government may say that it's different because we on Earth didn't sign up to be a doctor, it's the same thing if you see a stranger on the street. They have a broken leg, they've passed out, you have to give them CPR or consult someone who can give them that help. We, as inhabitants of Earth, by virtue of our position, have a responsibility to help this other species. Now, on to my second contention about the inherent value of life. Side government may say that this is very much like, I don't know, if there were some animal species and we shouldn't interfere with their natural way of life. Side government may attempt to convince you that death is an inevitable and natural part of the process of life on this planet that we should not mess with. However, there's one huge problem with this, which is that this is an actual civilization. We think it's problematic that side government doesn't have the appropriate level of empathy for this other species. And this is very dangerous. If they want to talk about colonialism, this is much like how colonizing peoples refuse to have empathy for indigenous populations and treated their lives as less valuable. Even if they're less technologically advanced, even if they're less genetically related to us, we still need to have empathy for these populations. And we as humans have no less responsibility to protect their lives as we have a responsibility to protect the lives of any one of us. And finally, with respect to the search for truth. As humans, we have, since the dawn of mankind, had a quest to find out the true nature of reality. This is the reason why when we hear about things like the Matrix, we instantly have a slight recoil. And given that, we believe it would be condescending for us to believe that we should leave them in their blissful ignorance, that we should hide to them where technology has gone and the fact that there is other intelligent life out in the universe. We, by the Infoslide, are benevolent. And since they're less technologically advanced, they are harmless. There is no immediate tangible downside that comes from this. So really what we're saying is that we want them to live in ignorance because we don't trust them with this knowledge. This is dangerous for two reasons. First, because it hinders their technological progress. It hinders them from finding other questions that may be valuable and problems worth solving. It also denies them the inherent value of enlightenment about what the universe is and what it contains. Now, side government may attempt to tell you in some rebuttal that we don't necessarily know that they want knowledge. Perhaps they're different from us and value ignorance more than knowledge. But given that we only have one data point of intelligent life, we on side op believe that we have to assume that knowledge is inherently valuable to them as well as to us. And even in the worst case, this contention is a wash, and we win on the grounds of complicity and value of life. Thank you.
Everyone good? Thank you, Madam Speaker. When you have a tight connection at the airport, you take the earlier flight just to play it safe. When you leave your house, you check that the oven's off just to play it safe. When you drive in the snow, you go just a little bit slower just to play it safe. All of our lives, since childhood, we have been taught the very basic principle that sometimes things simply are not worth the risk. This debate is a question of whether we want to follow this very basic principle that we have followed all our lives. Side opposition says no to this question and risks all the future human society along with it. We on side government will never waver in protecting advanced society today, tomorrow, and millions of years to come. For all these reasons and more, the motion should and must stand. Today, as your second government speaker, I will do a few things for you. Firstly, I wish to clash with some of the incredibly flawed points presented by side opposition. Secondly, I wish to give a brief outline of side government's rock-solid case. And finally, I will dive deeper into my own two constructive points. So firstly, let me clash with side opposition. They begin their case with this whole speech about how we are going to look on while others suffer. And yes, we on side government have empathy. We feel bad that they are suffering, but it is simply not our concern to deal with it. We have our own planet to deal with. We have our own people to protect. Why should we risk our lives to protect some far-off planet that we know nothing about and carries way more risks than rewards? Furthermore, they talk about how they are a benevolent society, so nothing can ever go wrong. But when we say, yes, they are benevolent, but societies change. Just because they are benevolent now doesn't mean that 50, 100, or 1,000 years from now, they will still be benevolent, and we have to look long-term. They also talk about how the Black Plague was incredibly deadly. And we agree, but the harsh reality is that Europeans survived without aliens, and we trust that their society can too. They also talk about how we are tolerating mass death. But the harsh reality is there could be mass deaths on our planets if we engage, as I will dive into later in my constructives. And finally, they continue on about how we are devaluing human life by some way. We are not devaluing human life. We want to protect human life, but simply the humans on our planet, on our system, the humans that we know, and the humans that have given us the power to protect them. And as I will talk about later, the risks that we have about potentially engaging is going to lose lives both in political and medical reasons. So, what are we going to talk to you about today on side government? My brilliant partner has already outlined our moral duty to our citizens and the principle of non-interference and how it has worked. And secondly, he has briefly introduced the horrible aspects of colonialism all throughout history. Today, I'm going to talk to you about, firstly, the potentially devastating impacts on future citizens on our own planets, and secondly, I wish to rebuild and dive deeper into the horrible colonial problems we've had and why history cannot repeat itself. So firstly, the horrible impacts on Earth citizens. The motion says, in its own wording, that this other planet is unaware of any other life. By going in and acting as their saviors in their hardest time, we risk alarming this planet of our very existence and facing two horrible consequences along with it. This will be geopolitical and medical. Firstly, on the medical consequences. While we may have the cure to one illness that they have, there is no guarantee to know that there are not others on this planet. We simply have no clue. Imagine the society has some other horrible plague that we don't know about, and now millions of lives are lost on our planet because people have come back with this disease. That is unacceptable. Equally concerning is the potential for us to actually do more harm than good. One example of this is the indigenous population in Canada. When European colonizers came over, they brought diseases which they were immune to, but what the indigenous people in Canada were not. As a result, tens of thousands of indigenous people died as a result. We fear that the exact same thing could happen here too. Imagine we bring some new horrible disease that we are immune to and people are killed on this new planet. There is simply no way to guarantee that this won't happen. As we have pointed out, and will continue to point out, it is simply not worth the risks. The second consequence is the potentially negative geopolitical ramifications of engaging with a completely unknown entity. Once we go into this new society and we wake them up to the fact that there is life on Earth and other planets, they could potentially have bigger dreams, like attacking us for geopolitical reasons. We don't know the size, the scale, or the dangers of this, or their military. So by going up there, we are potentially setting ourselves up for failure. And so when they say that we are devaluing life, we are not. We are valuing life. We simply want to protect the lives of our own citizens. The duty of a government, or the duty of a country, or the duty of a galaxy is to protect itself above all else. Going to this new planet could ruin lives on Earth, it could ruin lives on this new planet, and it could simply destroy society. It is not worth the cost. Secondly, I wish to dive into and rebuild deeper on my partner's point about the horrific impacts on colonialism all across the world throughout history. As has become clear through both of our speeches, going to this planet ends in three options. Brutal exploitation, like indigenous people have experienced all across the world, and we all know how this works out. Secondly, this new planet could begin to worship us as some kind of god that we have saved them, something not great as well. And then the last option is that we go into this huge geopolitical war with this planet, potentially destroying both lives. I think we can all agree, not great choices. But you seem to disagree.
If we're a benevolent species, why can't we just refuse to exploit them, tell them we're not gods, and not fight them?
Yeah, so we are a benevolent species. On the first two, sure, but if we don't want to fight them, the reality is even if we don't want to fight, they might want to. So no matter how much we say that we are here for peaceful reasons, the reality is this is an unknown entity. Maybe they're violent people. Maybe in 50, 100, or 1,000 years, they're going to decide that they want to expand beyond their own borders. And so the reality is we don't know what's going to happen. But the reality is they are willing to take the risk. We are not. Specifically, continuing on about the deadly impacts of colonization, the potential colonization of this country would be a horrific example of history repeating itself in a way we cannot be proud of. Every single instance, all throughout history, power-hungry countries have gone into places with this idea of saving others. It has failed every single time. Almost every minority all across the world have become victims of this failed approach, and we cannot repeat it again with a new planet. Side opposition had a clear burden today. They had to provide a plan. Do we give them medicine and then leave? Do we slightly engage and then leave? Do we set up colonization places? Do we stay there forever? They did not give a plan for what exactly it is we're going to do, so we on side government are immensely confused about their plan simply because there is none. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, this debate boils down to one key theme: risk. Are we, as a future society, millions of years away, willing to potentially risk everything, to throw it all away, to potentially fix a small problem that, frankly, we didn't start? Side opposition says no. No to safety, no to protecting their very own citizens, and yes to taking dangerous risks that we know we simply cannot afford. We on side government will never waver. We will never waver in fighting for every single citizen, no matter where they live, today, tomorrow, 1,000 years from now, and for the rest of time. For all these reasons and more, the motion should and must stand. Thank you.
Ooh, this is a very tiny table, and I have many, many pieces of paper. We're all good to get started? Perfect. It is quite damning for Proposition's second speaker to come up here and tell us that a plague affecting an alien society is not our concern to deal with. Because that is the same rhetoric used by Australian politicians when they try to push refugees away from their borders. It is the same rhetoric used by politicians in the EU to push away people who need help. I say that given that this advanced society is a future version of Earth, and given that we on Earth must care about individuals who need our help and for whom we are able to provide that assistance, that we have such a strong moral obligation to help this alien society, a moral obligation the Proposition was never able to contend with. What will I be doing in this speech? I will be answering 3 questions of refutation before going into a constructive argument of my own as to why making contact has longer-term benefits for both the society that we are helping and for the advanced society itself. But what are the 3 points of refutation that I'm going to prove to you? First, that the advanced society has an overpowering moral obligation to step in. Second, why providing that immediate salvation matters far more than preventing long-term dependence or this weird savior complex that they want to talk about. And lastly, why we're also not going to make the alien society dependent on us. Firstly then, I want to talk about why the advanced society has an overpowering moral obligation to step in. And I think our principal claim here was quite clear, and it came out of my first speaker. The fact that when you are capable of helping someone in need at a very limited cost to yourself, you are morally obligated to help them. So even if you have your fancy Hermes suit, if there is a child drowning, you are obligated to dive in and save them, even if that means that perhaps there are small costs to you because now your Hermes suit needs to be taken to the dry cleaners. We think, though, that that is a principal obligation that we uphold as a society and which must continue to be upheld. I will then prove, in this speech, both criteria for this principle. A, that saving the other advanced society comes at a tiny cost to the advanced society, and secondly, that this plague is going to cause the other society extreme suffering. So firstly then, why is it that saving them comes at a tiny cost to the advanced society? And I think Eric has already answered this question for me in his answer to my POI, where he says that, yes, it is quite fair to assume that the cure can be distributed at low cost to the advanced society. Given that the society is far more advanced, it's probably quite fair that they have required very little resources to create this cure that they already have created and probably can make economies of scale. But secondly, they try to say that, what if the alien species spreads an illness to us? Well, if we are incredibly advanced, we can probably just run away. We can probably wear personal protective equipment. I just don't think this is as big of a concern as they try to make it out to be.
QI?
That then is why it is not likely that this is going to be a huge concern. But go ahead.
Wouldn't you agree that the risk of death for the citizens that live on our planet is something that is incredibly concerning and they wouldn't be willing to take the risk of?
Sure. Maybe you can just have helicopters drop the cure down to the planet then instead, and you don't have to come into contact with them. I just think that there are many ways for us to prevent this from happening, and I don't think this is as big of a concern as they try to blow it up to be. That out of the way then, I want to characterize to you the extent of the devastation that a plague, which the Infoslide said would be similar to the Black Death, would actually wreak upon the society. Because I don't want Proposition to be able to get away with their diluted imagery, which they're employing to dilute the responsibility that their side would have to derelict. 1/3 of the world population died during the Black Plague. Entire towns were left with nothing but dead bodies. Entire families rendered incapable of caring for the people they loved because they themselves were sick in bed and waiting for death to reap them. Entire communities are made into gossamer carcasses of what they once were because that is what a plague with the extent of the Black Death would wreak upon a society. They tried to pretend that this wouldn't be as big of an issue, but we're telling you that these are entire communities that are going to be floating in a world devoid of hope and a world devoid of a future. They tried to tell you that, well, you know, the Europeans, they survived eventually, but even if centuries later they're able to rebuild and they're able to flourish, the mass pain, the mass suffering that is happening in this instance is not something that can be forgotten. It is mass suffering that is happening right now and that we have an ability to fix. It is mass suffering that will leave irreparable scars on the hearts of those who are affected, and we think that their callous language is not enough for them to be able to shed this duty. In spite of all of that suffering that Proposition could have prevented, Proposition would turn a blind eye under this wishy-washy, cold-blooded concept of non-interference, in which their best defense of was just that, well, maybe the people democratically chose that they wanted non-interference. But note that that in and of itself is an assumption that this was a democratically chosen principle, but also that many principles are simply adopted out of tradition, and principles need to be reevaluated as circumstances change. And we would say the fact that 1/3 of another world's population is dying is probably a pretty big change upon which we should probably be considering changing our traditions. So that is not enough of a refutation to deal with the great moral responsibility that our proposition team would throw out the door. That then makes it very clear that they are losing on the principle of helping them in the short term. My second theme of refutation is going to show to you why providing that immediate salvation in the short term matters far more than preventing this long-term speculative idea of dependence. I have two reasons why this matters far more. The first is that the potentially harmful long-term effects of your salvation making you into some Messiah-like figure are incredibly speculative claims that you hear out of the proposition side. Whereas on our side of the house, when we tell you that when the advanced society goes in with a cure, they will most definitely and most certainly save thousands and millions and billions of people, that is a very concrete and certain benefit compared to the speculations that they're trying to make. The second reason as to why providing immediate salvation matters more is that in the short term, there's only one way for you to save dying individuals. There's only one way for that to happen. Whereas these issues down the line, centuries in the future, probably by then we will have many different ways to address these various issues, which means that this motion is not as relevant in the future because there are other ways through which we're able to solve those issues. Given that, I think I've already made it very clear to you why we win on providing immediate assistance and why immediate assistance was the most important outcome within this debate. But let me now also engage with their content on the long term about how you're going to make the alien society dependent on the advanced one. We already told you that in the Infoslide, it stated that this advanced society is a benevolent one, which we can reasonably assume to mean that they do not actually want to intentionally make that alien society dependent on them. So when they tell you things like there's going to be colonial exploitation, we'd say to you that since the advanced society is a future version of Earth and Earth has experienced the consequences of colonialism, we will probably be quite careful in making sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. The same logic applies when they tell us that the advanced society is going to become a Messiah-like figure. We're telling you that we also know what the consequences of that look like because we live on Earth and this is part of our history. And given that, we're also likely to be able to avoid that from happening. What that is all to say then is that it is highly, highly, highly unlikely that any of their long-term harms will manifest themselves, but what is incredibly certain in this debate are the people whose lives they are failing to save, the children whose lives they are failing to save, and the people whose futures they are making into shattered dreams. Those are the harms that their side of the house were never able to contest on, and that I think my side wins quite clearly on. My last constructive argument then, why is it that making contact has longer-term benefits for the advanced society? And the strategic value of this point is that this debate has mainly been about the short-term, whether or not we're saving them thing. But I also think that, when they say in their model that they're never going to talk with a society at any point in life, I think that there are real consequences that come with that, because these societies have many values. Values which I think exist on both an exchange of trade and resources value, and also values that have to do with an exchange of knowledge. So firstly, on unique resources, we would say that given that this is an entirely different planet, they probably have entirely different plant life, ecosystems, minerals. These resources, which we think could be incredibly crucial in developing various medicines, infrastructures, technologies. And this has nothing to do with how how advanced that civilization might be, and more to do with the fact that they literally just have materials that could solve illnesses that we as an advanced society have yet to cure. Lives that could be saved if only we would be able to establish diplomatic relations with this other country. But also on unique knowledge that maybe they're not as technologically advanced, but hey, we were able to come up with great philosophies through Aristotle and Socrates far before we were traveling the 7 galaxies. Which is all to say that by collaborating with them, by building those ties with this other planet, we're able to facilitate the exchange of knowledge, the exchange of cultures that we think makes for better civilization both past this planet and both into the galaxy beyond. It is for that that I've been so proud to oppose. Thank you.
There we go. Competitors now will have 1 minute to prepare their reply speeches.
All right, I'm going to try not to mess up the mic this time. Honorable Speaker, let us contrast the two ethical theories on both sides of this House. On side op, we have the golden rule: do unto others as you would want done unto yourself. We have the generational wisdom of Kant's categorical imperative. On their side, they have the wisdom of America first, Earth first. We only care about people who look like us and who live next to us. 3 things then in this speech. First, a point on selfishness. Second, on why the colonial legacy is flawed. And third, on their unprincipled case. First, with respect to selfishness. As my partner has demonstrated in her speech, side government has an incredibly closed-minded case. Essentially, their logic is we should only care about humanity. That's the scope of our moral responsibilities. And that's simply not true. We believe that if you're a civilization, if you're an intelligent species, you have some worth and some value. And even if we slightly prioritize humanity, the simple truth is we could do a lot of good for relatively low cost, for relatively low, in their words, risk. Yes, there are perhaps some unintended consequences, but there will be clearly anticipated significant consequences if we don't do anything. What side government calls a small problem, we call mass murder. Side government said that we care about all citizens no matter where they live, but it seems that where they live must be Earth for them to care at all. Second, to their point on a colonial analogy, they use the history of colonialism to suggest that all contact is bad. But we don't believe that's true. The main reasons why contact with other populations has been bad in human history is 1, because of impure intent, despite claims of having religious intentions, and second, because humans have had imperfect capabilities and have created unintended consequences. However, by this motion, in this case, we've solved both problems. We are benevolent, we have the right intentions, and because we're so technologically superior, we have the ability to do the thing we want without a bunch of adverse consequences. Contact isn't always bad, and this is a rare case in which we can get all the gains with relatively little of the costs. And because they failed to prove the pragmatic impacts, namely that this will have unintended significant consequences to this other species, they must advance some principle of non-interference. And they've completely failed to do so in this debate. Because the truth is, the pragmatics can be overcome thanks to our vast technological superiority. Any little quibble they have, we can come up with some policy solution, and throughout this debate, we've continued to suggest those. But they've failed to demonstrate that this will not help this other species. Even though the first opposition speaker started to advance a contention that this would have harms, they eventually bailed on that, and primarily the harms they've been talking about are to humanity. They've given up on claiming to care about this other population. And because they failed to demonstrate significant pragmatic consequences in the presence of this technological imbalance, because they fail to seize upon our principle of helping others, and because their principle of me first is entirely unconvincing, we win this debate. Thank you.